The ballroom of the Grand Metropole was an architectural masterpiece of glass and gold, a cathedral of vanity designed to announce to the world that the name Arthur Bennett still held the weight of an empire. At 65, Arthur stood at the center of this shimmering universe, his silver hair neatly swept back, his tuxedo tailored with a precision that bordered on surgical. To the 300 guests sipping vintage Cristal, he was the epitome of a man who had conquered time itself. But as Arthur looked at his reflection in a polished silver tray, he didn't see a titan. He saw a man whose foundation was built on shifting sand. Every detail of the evening had been orchestrated by his daughter, Claire. She moved through the crowd with a predator's grace, her silk gown whispering against the marble floor as she laughed with investors and shared secrets with socialites. She was the star of the evening, and she knew it. Arthur watched her from the periphery, a ghost at his own feast. He had spent 4 decades building the very floor she walked on, yet tonight, he felt like a trespasser in his own legacy. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and expensive cologne, a sensory overload that usually signaled success. But for Arthur, it smelled like an ending. He reached out to touch the velvet curtain near the balcony, needing the cold touch of reality. He remembered a time when a birthday meant a handmade card and a messy cake in a kitchen that smelled of vanilla and warmth. Now, it meant a 5-course meal served by strangers and a daughter who hadn't looked him in the eye for more than 3 seconds since the clock struck 7. As the first course was cleared, the room settled into a practiced hush. It was time for the toasts, the part of the evening where words were used as currency to buy favor or settle old scores. Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands folded with a stillness he had perfected over years of boardroom battles. Beside him sat Julian, Claire's husband. Julian was a man of pedigree, the son of a banking dynasty that had seen better days, though he wore his family crest as if it were still minted in solid gold. Arthur glanced at Julian. The younger man was leaning back, a smirk playing on his lips as he whispered something to Claire. They looked like the perfect power couple, polished, ambitious, and utterly hollow. Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. He had always been a man of silence, believing that actions were the only language that mattered. He had built their world in that silence, funded their extravaganzas through silent transfers, and protected their reputations with silent interventions. Claire stood up, the light catching the diamonds at her throat. She raised her glass, her smile wide and radiant, the kind of smile that was meant for cameras, not for fathers. Tonight, Claire began, her voice amplified by the room's perfect acoustics. We celebrate 65 years of a life lived. We celebrate the name Bennett. Arthur braced himself, waiting for the warmth that never came. He looked at his daughter, searching for the little girl who used to catch snowflakes on her tongue, the one who once told him he was the strongest man in the world. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who saw him only as a relic of a bygone era, a fading monument to be maintained for the sake of the family brand. But more importantly, Claire continued, her tone shifting into something sharper, something more pointed. We celebrate the standards we must now strive to meet. Standards of true leadership and grace. Arthur's grip on his linen napkin tightened. He could feel the eyes of the room shifting toward him, then away, caught in the magnetic pull of Claire's growing intensity. He realized then that this wasn't just a birthday party. It was a coronation, and he was the monarch being nudged toward the exit. Arthur smiled back at his daughter, a practiced mask of paternal pride, but beneath the table, his thumb hovered over his phone, a device that held the digital keys to every luxury Claire had ever known, and a single command that could turn the lights out on her world forever. The atmosphere in the ballroom, once thick with the clinking of crystal and the hum of polite conversation, curdled into a suffocating density. Claire remained standing, her posture rigid, her glass raised not in a toast, but like a scepter of judgment. The diamonds at her throat caught the light, mocking the man who had paid for them. You speak of legacy as if it's a burden we should carry with gratitude. Father, Claire continued, her voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge that sliced through the room. But legacy isn't just surviving 65 years. It's about impact. It's about the stature one holds in the world. Look at Julian's father, a man of true distinction, a titan of the banking world. He doesn't just sit in a room. He commands it. He is the standard of what a father, a leader, and a man should be. She turned her gaze toward Arthur, and for the first time, the mask of the dutiful daughter fell away completely, revealing a cold, piercing disdain. You've always been so quiet, so small. You spent your life playing it safe, hiding behind your spreadsheets and your silence while the rest of the world moved forward. It's embarrassing, really, to have all this. She gestured vaguely at the opulent ballroom, and yet have no presence. If it weren't for Julian's family and their connections, we would be nothing more than footnotes in a story no one cares to read. Beside her, Julian didn't look away. He didn't offer a hand of restraint. Instead, he leaned back, a smug, proprietary smile playing on his lips. He looked at Arthur not as a father-in-law, but as a tedious obstacle that had finally been cleared. "She's right, Arthur," Julian added, his voice dripping with a faux sympathy that was more insulting than a shout. "In the circles we run in, your simple values are just another word for mediocrity. We've had to work twice as hard to build a reputation because we started with such a lackluster foundation from your side." Arthur felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes. He felt the pity of the strangers and the triumph of the two people he had loved most. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had worked 16-hour days in a dusty warehouse 40 years ago, the hands that had signed every tuition check, every mortgage payment, and every bailout for Julian's visionary business failures. A strange, crystalline calm settled over him. It was the peace of a man who had finally seen the bottom of the abyss. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, chilling clarity. Slowly, Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo. He pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. The screen glowed against the dimming light of the room. He didn't look up at Claire or Julian. His fingers moved with a rhythmic, practiced precision. "Presence is a curious thing, Claire," Arthur said, his voice low but carrying a resonance that made the guests at the far end of the room stop breathing. "You believe presence is found in the noise you make or the names you drop. You believe your husband's pedigree is the engine of your life." He tapped a sequence on the screen. On the massive LED displays behind the head table, which had been cycling through soft focus photos of Arthur's life, the images suddenly flickered and died. They were replaced by a stark, white interface, a private banking portal, the kind accessible only to the ultra-high net worth individuals of the world. "Let's look at the engine, shall we?" Arthur whispered. The screen displayed a master account, the AB Heritage Trust. Beneath it, a list of subsidiary accounts began to scroll. Account ending in -4,402. Monthly mortgage, Claire and Julian, paid. Account ending in -9,918. Business operating capital, Julian's Ventures, subsidized. Account ending in -1,120. Personal credit line, Julian Sr., liquidity provided by AB Trust. The room went into a shock-induced paralysis. Claire's face drained of color so quickly it looked as though she might faint. Julian's smirk didn't just vanish. It collapsed into a mask of pure terror. "You praise the shadow," Arthur said, finally looking up. His eyes were no longer those of a doting father. They were the eyes of a wolf who had allowed the sheep to play king for too long. "You thought Julian's father was the sun because he let you bask in the warmth. But I was the one fueling the fire. Every car you drive, every dress you wear, every connection Julian has made was bought with my silence and my money." Arthur stood up. He looked 10 feet tall in the sudden, deafening silence of the ballroom. "You told me I should learn how to be a real man from a man who has been living off my charity for 5 years," Arthur said, his voice as sharp as a guillotine. "You wanted a father who didn't just sit in a room, but commanded it. Well, Claire, listen to the command." His thumb hovered over a bright red icon on the screen labeled "Terminate all disbursements." "Dad." "Wait," Claire stammered, the word "dad" returning to her lips for the first time in years, but it was too late. The arrogance had been replaced by a frantic, ugly desperation. "You don't respect the man," Arthur said, "so you don't deserve his fruit." He pressed the button. A soft chiming sound echoed from the speakers, the sound of a transaction completed. Across the room, several phones began to buzz and ping simultaneously. Julian's phone shrieked with a high-priority alert from his bank. The credit lines were closed. The trust was revoked. The invisible floor they had been standing on for a decade simply ceased to exist. Arthur set the phone face down on the mahogany table. The light on the back of the device blinked once, then went dark. "The party is over," Arthur said quietly. "And for the first time in your life, Claire, you are going to find out exactly what you are worth without me." As Arthur walked toward the exit, the maitre d' approached Julian with a silver tray, not with more champagne, but with a bill for the evening that exceeded the total balance of every bank account Julian now owned. The echo of the digital chime seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the guests' bones. The ballroom, once a theater of high society performance, had become a tomb of expectation. Arthur stood amidst the wreckage of his daughter's pride, his expression unreadable, a statue of silver and shadow. Claire's hand, still clutching the crystal flute, began to tremble violently. The champagne sloshed over the rim, dripping onto her silk gown, a stain that looked like an ink blot on a white page. She looked at the screens, then at her husband, then back at the man she had just finished dismantling with her tongue. The reality didn't sink in all at once. It hit her in waves, like the aftershocks of an earthquake. "Dad, you're joking," she whispered, her voice cracking, the polished Claire Bennett persona fracturing to reveal the terrified girl underneath. You can't turn off a life. This is a birthday party. People are watching." "They are indeed watching," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of the warmth he had carried for 64 years. "They are watching the moment the theater curtains finally fall. You were so worried about presents, Claire. You wanted the world to see you as a titan. Well, here is your stage. Stand on it." Julian was staring at his phone as if it were a thermal detonator. His face had turned a sickly shade of gray. "Arthur, listen," he stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised in a gesture of frantic negotiation. "There's been a misunderstanding. The things Claire said, she's emotional. She didn't mean it. We respect you. We've always respected you. My father." "Your father," Arthur interrupted, the two words falling like heavy stones, "is currently 3 months behind on his penthouse lease. The only reason he hasn't been escorted to the curb by security is because my trust company holds the deed to the building. I didn't do it for him, Julian. I did it so my daughter wouldn't have to bear the shame of her in-laws being homeless. But it seems she finds that shame preferable to my mediocrity." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The banking dynasty that Julian had used as his social armor was exposed as a hollow shell, propped up by the very man they had spent the evening mocking. Claire finally found her breath, but instead of an apology, it came out as a snarl of panicked entitlement. "You can't do this. You gave that money to us. It was a gift. You're just being petty because I told you the truth. You've always been jealous of how much I admire Julian's family. Jealous of a man who actually knows how to lead." Arthur looked at her, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine sorrow crossed his eyes. Not for himself, but for the profound failure of his own fatherhood. He had provided so much that he had forgotten to teach her the value of the ground she stood on. "I wasn't jealous, Claire. I was tired," Arthur said quietly. "I was tired of being the invisible pillar holding up a house that refused to acknowledge it had a foundation. You call it petty. I call it an audit. If you truly believe that Julian's father is the standard of a man, then you should be thrilled. You are now free to go to him. You are free to live by his standards, on his dime, and through his stature." He turned to the room at large, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the elite, the powerful, and the curious. "Ladies and gentlemen, the bar is closed. The bill has been settled, by me, one last time. I suggest you find your coats. The air in here is about to get very cold." The guests didn't need a second invitation. The social instinct for self-preservation kicked in. No one wanted to be near a sinking ship, especially one as expensive as this. They began to shuffle out, their whispers filling the space like the rustle of dead leaves. They friends Claire had spent all evening impressing didn't even look at her as they passed. They looked at their shoes, their phones, anywhere but at the woman whose world had just evaporated. In less than 10 minutes, the ballroom was empty of everyone but the catering staff, who stood awkwardly by the walls, and the 3 people at the center of the storm. Julian grabbed Claire's arm, his grip tight. "Call the bank," he hissed at her. "Tell them it was an error. Tell them your father he's not in his right mind." "He's right here, Julian," Arthur said, walking toward the exit. "And he's never been more lucid." Claire ran after him, her heels clicking frantically on the marble. She reached out to grab his sleeve, But Arthur stepped aside with a grace that surprised her. He didn't let her touch him. The barrier wasn't physical. It was a wall of absolute indifference. Dad, stop. You're overreacting. How are we supposed to pay the staff at the house? How am I supposed to go to the charity gala next week? My entire life is scheduled around that fund. Arthur paused at the grand mahogany doors. He looked back at her, and the silence he had lived in for so long finally became his weapon. You told me I was small, Claire. You told me I had no presence. For the first time in your life, you are going to experience exactly what my presence felt like. It wasn't the money. It was the peace of mind. It was the safety. It was the fact that you never had to wonder if the world would bite you, because I was standing between you and the teeth. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket and tossed them onto a nearby table. They skittered across the wood with a metallic ring. Those are the keys to the Bentley. It's in my name. The driver has been instructed to take me home and then return the car to the dealership tomorrow. If you want to get home, I suggest you call an Uber. Or perhaps, he glanced at Julian, who was slumped in a chair, staring at his reflection in a soup spoon. Call your father. I'm sure his stature can hail a cab. You're leaving me? Claire whispered, her voice finally breaking into a sob. No, Arthur said, his hand on the door. I'm leaving the bank. You're the one who left me a long time ago. As the heavy doors swung shut behind him, Arthur pulled his coat tight against the night air. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a notification from his security system. A repossession team had just arrived at his daughter's estate to collect the art collection he had loaned her, and they weren't the only ones on the way. The week that followed the birthday gala was not a descent, it was a freefall. For Claire and Julian, the world didn't just change, it unraveled with the cold, systematic efficiency of a machine being dismantled. The first thing to go was the silence. The quiet life they had enjoyed, buffered by Arthur's wealth, was replaced by the cacophony of ringing phones and legal notices. By Tuesday, the pedigreed father-in-law, Julian Sr., had vanished to a wellness retreat in a non-extradition country, leaving behind a mountain of debt that Arthur was no longer interested in leveling. By Wednesday, the domestic staff at the Bennett estate, the chef, the housekeeper, the groundskeepers, had all resigned after their payroll transfers were returned with a chilling, insufficient funds notification. Claire sat in her sprawling, hollow kitchen, staring at a letter from the bank. It wasn't a request, it was an eviction notice. The house, which she had always referred to as our family seat, was technically owned by a holding company under the AB Heritage Trust. Since the trust had revoked its support, the holding company was liquidating the asset to rebalance the portfolio. He can't do this, Julian whispered, pacing the marble floor that now felt like ice. His designer suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. It's illegal. It's elder abuse. He's senile. He's not senile, Julian, Claire said, her voice dead. He's awake. That's the problem. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, without the filter of her father's money. Without the expensive watches and the tailored shirts Arthur had paid for, Julian looked small. His stature was nothing more than a costume. He wasn't a titan. He was a terrified boy who had never learned how to earn $1. The twist of the revelation began to deepen when Claire decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She looked through the old filing cabinets in the basement, searching for some loophole, some legal ground to fight back. Instead, she found a series of leather-bound ledgers. They weren't just bank statements. They were journals. As she flipped through the pages, the true scale of Arthur's silence began to emerge. For 20 years, her father hadn't just been paying their bills. He had been protecting their souls. She found records of a private investigator Arthur had hired 5 years ago when Julian was nearly caught in a predatory investment scam that would have landed him in federal prison. Arthur had paid the investors back out of his own pocket to keep Julian's name out of the headlines. He had settled Claire's exorbitant credit card debts from her boutique business, a business that had never actually sold a single item, but was kept afloat by a mysterious angel investor whose signature was a simple, stylized A. But the biggest shock, the one that broke her, was a folder marked the Julian Sr. Agreement. It was a contract. 10 years ago, Julian's father had approached Arthur, begging for a bailout. Arthur had agreed on one condition, that Julian Sr. would never tell Claire or Julian where the money came from. Arthur wanted his daughter to believe she had married into a great family. He wanted her to feel the pride of status, even if it was a lie, because he thought it would make her feel secure. The very pedigree she had used to insult her father was a gift he had bought for her to ensure she never felt mediocre. Claire dropped the folder. The room felt like it was spinning. Every insult she had hurled at the dinner table, every mockery of his simple clothes and his quiet life, was a strike against the man who had been her silent shield. She had called him a bystander in her life, yet he was the only reason she had a life at all. Just then, the front door chimes rang. It wasn't a guest. It was a repo man. "Mrs. Bennett?" the man said, standing in the foyer with a clipboard. He looked at her with a mix of boredom and professional detachment. "I'm here for the art collection. The Warhol in the dining room and the 3 sculptures in the garden. They've been recalled by the owner." "The owner?" Claire asked, though she already knew the answer. "Mr. Arthur Bennett," the man replied. "He's donating them to the City Museum this afternoon. Apparently, he feels they're wasted in a private residence." Claire watched as they crated the pieces that had defined her social standing. Without the art, the walls looked scarred. Without the staff, the house smelled of dust. Without the money, her husband looked like a stranger. She picked up her phone to call her father-in-law, the man she had praised as the true father figure. The call went straight to a disconnected line. He had cut his losses. He had no pedigree left to share. For the first time in her life, Claire felt the crushing weight of the vacuum Arthur had left behind. It wasn't just the lack of money, it was the lack of weight. The world was finally looking at her, and all they saw was an empty dress in an empty house. Claire grabbed her car keys, desperate to drive to Arthur's house and beg for mercy. But as she stepped into the garage, she found it empty. The pedigree husband she had defended had already taken the last remaining car and the little cash they had left, leaving her alone in the silence her father had once filled. The silence in Arthur's small, suburban home was a stark contrast to the hollow grandeur of the mansion Claire had just lost. He sat in his study, a room filled with books that actually showed wear and a desk made of solid oak, not the glass and chrome vanities Claire preferred. He wasn't celebrating. He was mourning. He was mourning the version of his daughter he had tried to preserve, a version that had died the moment she traded her gratitude for a false sense of superiority. There was a frantic, rhythmic pounding at his front door. Arthur didn't move at first. He waited until the 4th set of knocks, which had descended into a rhythmic sobbing, before he stood up. When he opened the door, Claire looked like a ghost of her former self. Her silk dress was stained and wrinkled from walking in the rain. Her makeup had run, leaving dark streaks down her face. She was alone. No Bentley, no husband, no pedigree to shield her from the damp night air. "Dad," she choked out, the words sounding like a plea for oxygen. "He's gone. Julian took everything left in the safe. He took the car. He said if there was no money, there was no point in staying. He told me I was useless to him now." Arthur stood back, allowing her to stumble into the foyer. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer a towel. He simply stood there, a pillar of quiet observation. "The man you praised as the epitome of success," Arthur said softly, "seems to have a very transactional definition of loyalty." Claire collapsed onto the floor, her head in her hands. "I was wrong. I saw the ledgers, Dad. I saw the agreements. You paid for everything. You protected us from his father's debts. You saved Julian from prison. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe the lie?" "Because I wanted you to be proud of the life you chose," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of anger, which made it hurt more. "I thought that if I provided the safety, you would provide the character. I thought that by removing the stress of survival, I was giving you the room to become a great person. But I realize now that by removing the struggle, I removed the strength. I turned you into a person who confuses price with value." "I'm sorry," she wailed, reaching out to grab the hem of his trousers. "Please, just one more chance. Call the bank. Stop the eviction. I'll do anything. I'll apologize to everyone. I'll tell them the truth. Just don't leave me with nothing." Arthur looked down at her. This was the moment most people expected, the grand reconciliation, the father's heart melting at the sight of his child's tears. But Arthur had seen the depth of her disdain at the party. He had seen the way she looked at him when she thought he had nothing to offer. He knew that if he restored the funds now, he wouldn't be saving her. He would be enabling the very poison that had destroyed their relationship. "You aren't left with nothing, Claire," Arthur said, his voice firming. "You have your health. You have your education. The one I paid for at a university you never attended half the classes of. You have the clothes on your back. That is more than I had when I started the company that built your world. He walked over to his desk and picked up a small, weathered envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table near her. Inside that envelope is the address of a small apartment in the city. The first month's rent is paid. There is also a list of 3 staffing agencies. They are looking for entry-level administrative assistants. Claire looked up, her eyes wide with horror. Administrative assistants? Dad, I was a CEO. I ran a boutique. You ran a tax write-off funded by my silence. Arthur corrected her gently, but firmly. You have never run anything in your life. It is time you learned. But what about the trust? She begged. What about my inheritance? Arthur leaned down, his face inches from hers, and for the first time, Claire saw the true iron in the man she had called weak. The trust is being liquidated and donated to a vocational school for children who actually want to work for a living, he whispered. As for your inheritance, I'm giving you the only thing of value I have left to give, the necessity of effort. Claire looked at the envelope on the mahogany table as if it were a poisonous viper. The address written in her father's precise, architectural script represented a reality she had spent her entire life insulating herself against. To her, entry-level was a term for other people, the faceless masses who served her drinks, parked her cars, and curated her social media presence. You're serious, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and growing resentment. You're actually going to let your only daughter live in a tenement and answer phones for a living? Dad, look at me. I'm a Bennett. I have a reputation. What will people say when they see me taking the bus? The people you are worried about have already stopped saying your name, Claire, Arthur replied, his voice as steady as a mountain. They were never your friends. They were spectators to your bank account. And as for being a Bennett used to mean being a person of utility, a person who solved problems instead of creating them. You've kept the name, but you've lost the meaning. This is your chance to find it again. Claire stood up, her grief curdling into a familiar, sharp-edged arrogance. This isn't a lesson, it's a punishment. You're enjoying this, aren't you? After all these years of being the quiet provider, you finally get to be the one with all the power. You're no better than Julian's father. He used money to control people, and now you're using the lack of it to do the same. Arthur didn't flinch. He had expected the lashing out. It was the final defense mechanism of a pride that had no other weapons left. If I wanted to control you, Claire, I would have kept paying the bills. Control is keeping someone dependent. Freedom is giving them the tools to survive without you. I am choosing to set you free. I don't want this kind of freedom, she screamed, the sound echoing through the modest hallway. I want my life back. Your life was a beautiful lie that I authored for you, Arthur said, finally standing up. His presence seemed to fill the room, not through volume, but through an absolute, unshakable weight of character. But tonight, the book is closed. I am no longer your benefactor. I am just a man who lived a long life, worked very hard, and decided that his final act would be to stop being an accomplice to his daughter's vanity. He walked to the door and held it open. The rain had turned into a soft, persistent mist, and the streetlights cast long, orange shadows across the pavement. Take the envelope, Claire, or don't. The choice is yours. But the locks on the estate have already been changed, and Julian has already been served with the divorce papers my lawyers prepared this morning. You are at a crossroads. One path leads back to the person you were at the dinner table, bitter, entitled, and ultimately hollow. The other path starts with an alarm clock at 6 a.m. Claire stared at him, searching for even a glimmer of the soft father she had known. She saw none. She saw only the man who had built an empire from nothing, and she realized for the first time that the silence she had mocked was actually the sound of a man who didn't need to bark because he knew he held the leash. She snatched the envelope from the table, her knuckles white. Fine, I'll take your freedom, but don't expect me to come back and thank you when I'm exhausted and broke. I don't expect thanks, Claire, Arthur said quietly as she stepped out into the night. I expect growth. As she walked down the driveway, her heels clicking a desperate, uneven rhythm on the asphalt, she didn't look back. She didn't see Arthur lean against the doorframe, his shoulders finally sagging, his eyes closing in a brief, agonizing moment of fatherly pain. He watched her disappear into the darkness, knowing that he had just done the hardest thing a parent can ever do. He had let go of the safety net while his child was still falling. The next morning, the golden daughter of the Bennett Empire arrived at the address in the envelope. It was a small, third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where the air smelled of exhaust and cheap coffee. The walls were thin, the radiator hissed like an angry cat, and the view from the window was of a brick wall and a rusted fire escape. She sat on the edge of the twin bed, her designer coat draped over a plastic chair. Her phone, which usually buzzed every 30 seconds with invitations and gossip, was silent. No one was calling. No one was coming to save her. She looked at the list of staffing agencies. Her hand hovered over the phone. For the first time in 30 years, Claire Bennett was afraid. Not the fear of a social faux pas or a bad investment, but the raw, primal fear of insignificance. She realized that if she didn't call, she wouldn't eat. If she didn't work, she wouldn't have a roof. She finally dialed the first number on the list, her voice cracking as she told the operator she was looking for any work available, unaware that the person on the other end of the line was a woman Arthur had quietly helped years ago, with strict instructions to give Claire the hardest, least glamorous job in the building. The transition from silk sheets to synthetic linen was not a journey. It was a violent collision with the earth. 2 years had passed since the night of Arthur's 65th birthday, and the woman who once looked at the world through a prism of gold now looked at it through the steam of a kitchen sink. Claire's hands, which used to be manicured weekly, were now perpetually dry, the skin around her knuckles cracked from hours of clerical work and the harsh detergents of a second job she took cleaning offices at night. She lived in a reality of numbers, not the abstract millions of her former life, but the agonizing mathematics of survival. $42 for groceries, $115 for the electric bill, $8.50 for a bus pass. Every cent was a victory. Every unexpected expense was a crisis. Julian was long gone, having surfaced briefly in the tabloids a year ago after being arrested for a minor fraud scheme in a neighboring state. He had reached out to her once, asking for money. She had laughed, not with malice, but with a weary, enlightened clarity. She had nothing to give because, for the first time, everything she had was hers. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Claire found herself standing in front of the modest house where her father lived. She didn't come in a Bentley. She didn't come wearing diamonds. She came in a worn coat she'd bought at a thrift store, carrying a small white box from a local bakery. It was Arthur's 67th birthday. She knocked, and when Arthur opened the door, he didn't see the princess of the Bennett Empire. He saw a woman whose shoulders were set with the quiet strength of someone who had carried her own weight. Her face was thinner, her eyes older, but there was a light in them that had been absent for decades, the light of self-respect. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said softly. Arthur stepped aside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had watched her from a distance, of course. He knew about the nights she spent working overtime. He knew about the time she walked 3 miles in the rain because she didn't have enough for the fare. Every instinct in him had screamed to intervene, to send a car, to pay the bill. But he had stayed his hand, knowing that to save her was to break her. They sat at his small kitchen table. No catering staff, no vintage cristal. Just 2 cups of tea and a modest lemon tart. "I saw the news," Claire said, stirring her tea. "The AB Heritage Trust finished its final disbursement. The vocational school is fully funded. You really did it. You gave it all away." "I kept enough to live," Arthur said, his voice warm. "But the rest, it was a weight, Claire. It was a wall between us. I wanted to see what was on the other side of that wall." "I'm on the other side," she said, looking him in the eye. "And I wanted to say thank you. I hated you for a long time. I thought you were cruel. I thought you were trying to kill me." She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. "But you were the only person in my life who loved me enough to let me fail." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded check. It was for $300. It was a fraction of what she used to spend on a single pair of shoes, but to Arthur, it looked like a fortune. "This is the first of many," she said. "I know I can never pay back what you spent on me, but I want to pay for my own existence now. I want to be a Bennett again, the kind that solves problems." Arthur looked at the check, then at his daughter. He felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to his eyes. This was the moment he had gambled everything on. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her palm was rough, calloused, and beautiful. "You've already paid it back," Claire, he whispered. You're standing on your own feet. A week later, Claire received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the bank, and it wasn't an eviction notice. It was a job offer for a middle management position at a reputable logistics firm. The salary was decent, enough to move into a better apartment, enough to start a modest savings account. She knew her father hadn't handed her the job. He had merely ensured her resume reached the right desk. The rest, the 3 rounds of interviews, the competency tests, the grit, had been hers. She sat in her small apartment, looking at the city lights. She thought about the pedigree she had once worshipped. It wasn't found in bloodlines or bank accounts. It was found in the ability to look in the mirror and know that your life was a house you had built with your own hands. She picked up the phone and dialed Arthur's number. Dad, I got the job, and I was thinking, maybe next weekend we could go for a walk in the park? No fancy dinner, just a walk. Arthur's voice came through the line, sounding younger than he had in years. I'd like that, Claire. I'd like that very much. The edge of silence had finally been crossed. The noise of vanity had been replaced by the quiet, steady hum of a life well lived. Arthur hung up the phone and looked at the photo on his desk, not the one of the gala, but an old, grainy photo of a little girl learning to ride a bike. He had let go of the seat then, and he had let go of the seat now. Both times, she had wobbled, she had screamed, and she had fallen. But now, finally, she was flying. Arthur opened his desk drawer and took out a final, unmailed document. A deed to a small plot of land he'd bought for her years ago, not to be given until she no longer needed it, proving that a father's love doesn't end when the subsidies do. It simply waits for the daughter to find her way back to the truth.